Good morning, everyone.
Good morning to all virtual and in-person attendees. Please, for virtual assistants, turn off your microphone during all the conference. Well, first, we apologize for canceling a conference yesterday. Patrizio Mariani was sick, so he will record his conference and be uploaded later. And well, it's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Ignacio Gestoso. Ignacio is an expert in the field of climate change impacts on ecological processes on marine and benthic communities, especially working on invasive species for more than 15 years. His broad experience in several international centers like University of Montpellier in France, in marine and environmental research center in Madeira, and at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in United States. Ignacio is currently postdoctoral researcher here at Cádiz University. I met him, so I can also say that he's an excellent researcher and a fantastic colleague as well. So I would like to thank you, Ignacio, to say yes with any doubt when you proposed to be a speaker. So thank you for your dedication and support in this Euromarine conference series.
Thank you very much, Rocío. Good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I mean, it's a pleasure for me to be here and have the opportunity to talk about marine biological invasions. I will try to talk about mechanisms, impacts, and management, but without being too boring for all of you. I mean, it's almost 1 hour of talk, so I think I will try to go faster and try to, but have an overview of all the mechanisms, management options that we can have, the main impacts, okay? So the first slide that I want to show is just a cartoon as like an introduction of what, before starting to talk about biological invasions. So this cartoon to visualize that we have a lot of problems. I mean, it's not just biological invasions. We have to keep in mind always that we are in a very impacted world, and probably we are the most invasive species in the world, and so probably we are the problem, okay? This is always something important to keep in mind. We are going to talk about biological invasions, but we have at the same time all the other stressors that are interacting and in many cases are promoting the biological invasions. So yeah. So for example, and in the context of coastal areas that are my main environment, benthic communities in coastal areas, these areas support a lot of different local and global impacts. Of course, all of them in the context of climate change. And for example, we have habitat destruction of the coastal environment as a very important impact or stressor. We have, of course, overfishing, and also pollutants, a lot of, for example, marine plastic or marine debris in the sea. And of course, invasive species, that is the topic of today. But I wanted to visualize all these stressors that are at the same time happening in the coastal environment, because it's important always consider the potential interaction and simultaneity of the effects of these stressors in the benthic communities. So just to introduce briefly a bit of the ecology of biological invasions, we can say that Charles Elton was the founder of this branch of ecology. When he published in 1958 his book, The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. But already Charles Darwin started to mention it in The Origin of Species, some cases of invasive species. Today is a very trendy topic, as you all probably know, in ecology, no? And it's publishing a lot of publications and different studies in scientific journals. But even so, we have some negationists, or some denialists of this branch of ecology. For example, some authors suggest that changes in biogeographical distribution or ranges of the species always happen. Or, for example, there are different viewpoints of the effect of introduced species. No? And for example, from a socioeconomic viewpoint, can be sometimes beneficial or positive. No? So there is still some controversial opinions, and it's not an easy topic. But today, biological invasives are, of course, recognized as one of the major impacts in for the biodiversity conservation, and especially in coastal environments and benthic communities is a very important topic. So in relation with the dispersion of the species, what happened in the past is that there were always barriers, there were always filters, environmental filters and also biological filters, and especially the biogeographic filters that delimited the expansion of the species, no? At larger scales, we can say. The problem as we are the problem here, as I wanted to visualize in the first slide, the human introductions, that we are jumping these barriers, especially the biogeographic filters. No? So we are promoting the expansion of the species. And at this point, I would like to talk about some important definitions of concepts in biological invasions. That is probably one of the weaknesses that we have in this branch of ecology. Sometimes we have very repetitive nomenclature for the same thing. There is no common use of the same word for definition of an introduced species. For example, you can find in the literature that they are talking about alien species, exotic species, no indigenous species. So it's important to try to do a compendium, no, about the different definitions and concepts. So in this sense, especially for the biogeographic, okay, we have the autochthonous species, that is a native species originally from an area. But then we have an introduced species, that is the species that is intentionally or accidentally introduced in a new environment by human actions, no? That are promoting the displacement or the movement of the species. But this species is still conserved to a small area. I mean, it's localized. It maintains some small populations in the introduced environment, but it's not spreading and it's not dominating the new environment. And this is the big difference with invasive alien species. That is an introduced species, but that is able to dominate, is spreading regionally, and is having an impact, or has at least the potential to have an important impact that can be at the ecological level or also socioeconomic, or even in the human health. Then we have the cryptogenic species, that basically is when we don't know the origin, or it's difficult to assign the biogeography. This is very common. This is also a problem in our studies. And for example, a lot of widespread or cosmopolitan species are in this group, are cryptogenic. We don't really know the origin or the native range of this species. And finally, we have the neonative species. That is a new term introduced now in 2019, suggested to talk about these species that are spreading because of the environmental change, that are expanding their distribution range. I put there that is controversial because it depends of the authors. Sometimes it's considered as a invasion, or sometimes not. This is why they introduce this neonative species term. So the fact is that at present we have alien species or non-indigenous species detected in all the oceans all over the world. And in total, it is estimated that we have 1,711 non-indigenous species globally. And almost 60 of them are considered invasive. And in the case of Europe, in marine waters, we have almost 900 species, alien species introduced. Most of them in the last decades were detected. The first introduction in Europe, in fact, started with the increase in the global maritime trade. As we will see later, this is the main vector for the introduction of species. And here you can see, for example, two species that were introduced by aquaculture, but that are widespread in Europe, the Tapis philippinarum and Magellana gigas, that are the oyster and the clam from Japan. And they are really common introduced species, and maybe now in some cases they are considered naturalized because they are so common that is. The fact is that the introduction of falling species or non-indigenous species has been accelerated by the increase in the transportation routes, the increase in the maritime trade. As you can see in this map that are showing the main routes connecting all the coasts all over the world and the intensity of these routes. We have routes connect all the coasts from all over the world. And this is what happened, that we have detected, or we have records of alien species in all the coast, almost all the coast. Of course, we can see there probably a bias related with the intensity of the research. No? In the North Hemisphere, or for example, in Australia, New Zealand, the intensity of research focus on detection and biological invasives is stronger, so we can have this bias. And for our particular place, like in the Strait of Gibraltar Strait or south part of Iberian Peninsula, we can say that this is a hotspot for the marine traffic. This picture is from yesterday, from this website, Marine Traffic, that you can see alive all the boats and the different ships and all the marine traffic. And of course, the Gibraltar Strait is a hotspot for marine traffic and probably for the niche introduction, no? For the alien introduction. The thing is that there are different mechanisms by which a species can be transported to a new location. No? They can travel through different pathways, through different mechanisms. This is what we know as vectors of introduction. That can be basically primary and secondary. The difference is that, for example, the secondary vectors are those vectors that are spreading more regionally, like, for example, the recreational boats that are transferring between marinas, or between small harbors in the region. So, of course, we have the shipping as the main vector, but we also have the canals, we also have the global trade in marine ornamental species. Aquaculture is a very important vector of introduction, and we have what I named here new vectors that at present are incrementing the number of vectors of introduction. For example, the floating marine debris. No? So marine traffic has basically two mechanisms. That is the biofouling of the boats, like any surface that is exposed to or is submerged in the sea can be colonized by this process, no? Encrusting animals, especially sessile animals, but also mobile fauna associated with this fouling. And this is basically a big problem, especially in the recreational boats. So for the local boats that are moving between the small marinas locally, or for example, associated with the fisheries. Okay. Then we have, of course, the main vector that are the ballast water, that the cargo vessels use these ballast tanks to fill with water, or in some cases with sediments, to balance the ship when they are not with the cargo. So they take as you know, they take the water from the origin, and then discard all this water with all the organisms in the destiny. So of course, as you can imagine, this is a very stressful environment. This is why a lot of these organisms don't survive to these voyages, fortunately. But at the same time, as you can imagine, these organisms, if they are able to survive to these conditions, this means that they are strong. So in some cases, we are selecting the stronger ones. And these ones can be more invasive or more tolerant to the conditions in the new environment. The dimension of the problem with the ballast water is so high that today, finally, we have some regulation starting to be applied. This is the ballast water management convention proposed by the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. It was proposed in 2004, and finally in 2017 it started to be applied and be active. But still the boats will have until 2024 to be ready. I mean, it's mandatory that for that year, 2024, all the ships need to have a system to filter, to depurate the ballast water to a minimum level of organisms, larvae, etc. Okay. Okay, so also we have the aquaculture. That is a very important vector, especially because it's intentional. So this is quite polemic vector, we can say. A lot of species were introduced and are still introduced for commercial purpose, for aquaculture. And the fact is that in addition to the potential spread of these species that are introduced, they in some cases can introduce associated species. So that can introduce other exotic species, or even diseases or parasites. As in this case, for example, Magellana gigas, the Japanese oyster, was introduced, and at the same time, this species introduced Bonamia striae, and parasite that is affecting to the native oyster, the Ostrea edulis. This happens in several parts of Europe. But it's true that aquaculture, at least, was the first vector of introduction with some type of regulation. They established that in 2007, at least in the implementation of a quarantine for these organisms. And also, you cannot see because of the panel, but also a risk of invasion, a risk of propagation, okay? Establish that. We have also the canals as a very important vector of introduction, particularly the Suez Canal and also the Panama Canal. In the case of the Suez Canal, is responsible of more than 100 translocation of marine fish species. For example, the Pterois miles, the lionfish, was introduced in the last decade, introducing from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. And in both cases, as you can see there, they were constructed more than 100 years ago. But recently, they were expanded. And this is incrementing the transfer of the species. Because, for example, and particularly in the Panama Canal, it has intermediate lakes. So the marine species are not so tolerant to these lower salinities, but with the expansion of the canal, the conditions are more similar to the marine environment. So they are incrementing the probability for the transfer of marine species. Okay. In relation with the new vectors, the first vector that is today more important is the floating marine debris. That was reported, first time was reported after the tsunami that happened in Japan in 2011. After this tsunami that was dramatic and destroyed basically all the coast of Japan, or the area were affected from the coast of Japan, a lot of objects and even infrastructures, even entire docks, as you can see there, were floating in the ocean. And during the next 6 years after the tsunami, they were appearing, they were arriving to the coast of North America and also Hawaii, with all the organisms from the coast of Japan. And in this paper, for example, from Carton and colleagues, published in Science in 2017, they reported almost 300 native species from Japan that were arriving to this coast, to the coast of North America. The new thing from this vector is a new vector, but it's also introducing new mechanisms, because it's like very a very buffering, we can say. I don't know exactly how to explain. In comparison, if you can imagine, we were talking about the ballast water, the ballast tanks. It's a very stressful environment, but in this case, it's a very friendly environment. I mean, you can imagine this dog floating in the middle of the ocean with all the algae, and in between all the crustaceans, etc. are fine. I mean, they are traveling in a spa, something like that, you know. Like, so it introduced like new things in the problem. Yeah, here I want to show you a study case that where I was collaborating during my times in Madeira Island for study this phenomena of the potential of floating marine debris to transport the species we were collaborating with society, in particular with the nautical companies as well, watching companies, also the dive centers and fishermen. And what we asked to them is, okay, you are passing a lot of time in the sea, you know, so you are able to see and collect all the floating marine debris. And if you see that they have organisms attached, they are incrustations, please call us and we will go and check and verify and sampling. And through this this collaboration, we detected 150 taxa. I think now because this work is still in progress, they continue to collaborate, and they are collecting more and more taxa. So we verified that in fact this is a new vector for the region, and a lot of these species, not a lot, but a quite abundant, relative abundance of the species were indigenous for the region. Okay. Another new vector related with the definition that we established, if you remember during the first slide, the neonative species, is the tropicalization. Is the movement, the increase in the distribution range of the species to colder latitudes. And for example, in this article from Canning-Claude et al. In Diversity and Distribution, they describe the increase in the distribution rates of several species from the Macaronesia to colder latitudes. Yeah, this is a bit controversial still, but from my view, we are behind again, because this is happening because of the climate change, because of the increase in the temperatures. So yeah, I don't know. We can talk later if you want, and maybe discuss about this. And finally, maybe more as an anecdotically vector of introduction, but also interesting because it gives a view of the complexity of the problem, is the transport of organisms associated with the live bait for fishing. As you all know, the fishermen usually use polychaetes as live bait for fishing, and they bought this in boxes associated with macroalgae to maintain the humidity and survive better to the journey. And the thing is that these authors, Fowler and Gold, studied this macroalgae, these boxes, and they found almost 60 different macroinvertebrate taxa in addition to the polychaetes. Okay, so the thing is that other authors in this paper also studying the similar thing. They describe how a lot of these polychaetes are not local. I mean, are not from the region. They are imported, most of them, from China, for example, Vietnam, or the United States. So what happened? That when the journey is finished, what do the fishermen? I mean, they don't care about the about the macroalgae in general. I mean, some of them maybe, but basically they threw the rest of the macroalgae to the sea. So this is what happened. They introduced at the end several of these species. So they describe in these papers as a new vector. So whatever the transport, the mechanism of transport, whatever the vector of introduction that is introducing a new species in a new environment, this species has to pass an invasion process, has to overcome different barriers, different phases, starting from the transport, but then the colonization, the establishment of the species in the new environment, the local and regional spread, and then an increase in abundance. And during this process, the invader species, the introduced species, has to react and interact with the environmental, but especially with the biological factors, biological components of the resident system, the resident ecosystem. This is what we name the naturalization invasion continuum. And in this process, the exotic alien species or non-indigenous species can end as a casual species, can remain as a naturalized species that maintains like local populations, but without a real impact and not dominating the new environment, or can be at the end an invasive species that is maintaining populations, is spreading and dominating the habitat, and is finally having an impact in the new ecosystem. So this is a big question, even starting from Elton, from the times of Elton. What are the processes behind this invasion? What are the mechanisms that are mediating, what are the biological interactions that can promote or can reduce the invasion success of the introduced species? And already Elton suggested this hypothesis, that is the biotic resistant hypothesis, that in theory suggested that high diversity communities will be more resistant to the invasion. This was revised by different authors, and it has really contradictory results, especially at different scales. And this is what we name the invasion paradox. But anyway, from these original works, a lot of authors are suggesting different hypotheses to try to explain what makes a native ecosystem or an invasive species more successful or not during the invasion process. And for example, we have the enemy release hypothesis that suggests that the species, when it's introduced in a new environment, is release of the native predators or the native consumers that originally has in their origin, in the area of origin. So this gives like an advantage to colonize and dominate in the new environment. We have then these two other hypotheses, that is evolution of increased competitive ability and novel weapons, that are quite related, that basically suggested that they have toxic or deterrents for example, in the case of macroalgae, for the herbivores or against the predator. This is probably one of the main factors that is behind the invasion process, the invasion success of Rugulopteris ocamurae here, maybe, probably. And we have finally these two hypotheses that are also related, that describes the facilitation. For example, the fact that we have already some invaders in one region, very successful invaders, can facilitate the entrance, can facilitate other new incomers, other new invasive species. So now I am going to explain like a couple of studies that I developed working with this type of ecological interactions, making experiments, experimental approach. And the context was this invasion process that was happening in the north of Spain, in Galicia, in the Rías Baixas of Galicia, two estuaries. And we have this introduced species, this exotic mussel species, Xenostrobus ecuris, that you can see in the right side. The picture is not really good, sorry. And basically, it was introduced in part of the estuaries, and then was spreading to the open sea, and competing with the native species, the Mytilus galloprovincialis, in the intertidal. So what we did was a couple of experiments. This first experiment trying to evaluate the biotic resistance, basically the competition and the predation effects on the invasion and the spreading of the introduced mussels. What we did was a manipulative experiment in the field, manipulating the density of the aggregations and also the configuration. So basically, we did monospecific aggregations and mixed aggregations, and changing the density to evaluate the intraspecific and the interspecific competition. Also, we used exclusion cages to manipulate the access of the predators. And what we found was that the survivorship of the exotic species was enhanced by the presence of the conspecific and particularly of the native mussels. So when exposed to predators, the exotic species increase the survivorship because of the presence of conspecific. So we suggested a positive density effect by the presence of the native mussel in the case of the invader. So we concluded that facilitation was stronger than competition in this particular case. And at the end, the presence of the native mussel favored the invasion of the exotic mussels by improving their capacity to survive against the predation. But But then we said, okay, and what can happen in the future? What can happen under the environmental the context of climate change? So we proceed with a similar experiment, but exposing the same aggregations to a heat wave in tanks, in mesocon system, okay, indoor conditions. And what we did first was try to characterize a heat wave event in the field. So we use these robomussels that are basically loggers to characterize to measure the temperature, and we detected this heat wave event in July-August 2013, with a peak of temperature of more than 40 degrees exposed to the air during the low tide. And what we did was simulate this heat wave in tanks in the mesocons, creating the similar aggregations, monospecific and mixed, using the native and the exotic species. And we measure different ecophysiological variables as response. For example, heartbeat of the muscles, the gaping, that is the aperture of the valves of the muscles, and also the hits of proteins, respiration, mortality, etc. And what we found was interesting, because we found the opposite effect. What we found was that there was a cooling effect by the presence of the Xenostrobus ecuris, the invasive species, the introduced one, that benefit the native one in this case. And the mechanism behind this was the gaping behavior. The fact that the gaping behavior of the Xenostrobus ecuris was more active, was more regular, and at the end was like a cooling effect at the micro scale of the aggregation. And this benefit and favor the physiological capacity of the native species. So there was a positive ecological interaction, but in the opposite direction. So this benefit the capacity of the native mussel, in this case, the presence of the invasive one, to tolerate better the heat stress. So this is a good example of how the environmental conditions can change the biotic interactions and also the result of an invasion process, for example, in this case. Whatever the mechanism behind an introduction, most of the introduced species, luckily, are not finally invasive. Most of them are not able to colonize. Just a few of them are at the end invasive. But when they are invasive and dominate the new environment, they are able to displace, in some cases, the native organisms, the native species, and even in some cases, some native species can disappear or reduce the population a lot. So this, of course, has unpredictable consequences for the community structure and also ecosystem functioning. And this has negative impacts at different levels: ecological impacts, socioeconomic impacts, and also even in some cases, consequences for the human health. But the question is, which are the worst invaders? I mean, okay, we know that we have the vectors, we have a lot of non-indigenous species introduced, but we need to do something. So we need information. We need to know where we can put the focus. No, what are the worst invaders? No. And for that, this is what I want to introduce now, some tools for this, no, to manage, to try to deal with this problem. No? And the first tool are the databases for invasive species or non-indigenous species. We have a lot, maybe too many of databases, but they are really useful. What I mean is that sometimes we have redundant information. No? But of course, I would recommend the database of Global Invasive Species Database, that is the list database from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And in particular for the marine environment, a very good database, very rigorous and complete database is the Nemesis, that is the database from the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, where you can find information from a lot of non-indigenous species from the marine environment in the different coasts of the world. And now I'm going to introduce 3 dramatic examples, just to visualize the impact that different groups can have in when they are expanding and dominating and invading a new habitat. And the first example is the zebra mussel, Dreissenia polymorphan. This species is native from the Caspian Sea and Black Sea, and it was introduced by the European canals in the rest of Europe in the cycle 18 and 19, and after that it was also introduced in North America, especially in the Great Lakes. And yeah, it's a strong invader. It can disperse very easy, and it has drastic economic and also ecological consequences. And the consequences are so high that it's even recognized like a logo, like a logotypo for the invasive species. And we have also this problem, of course, in Spain and also in Andalusia, in the Guadiana River and other lakes and other parts. And for example, here you can see that the regional government are promoting some actions, trying to manage and try to control the expansion. For example, suggesting to the fishermen and that they can check the boats before moving between rivers or between lakes. The other species that I want to show you here is the killer algae, Caulerpa taxifolia. I don't like this type of names like killer algae or, you know, demoniac or something like that. I don't like it too much. I think this was suggested by some journalists when the Caulerpa was spreading. As you know, we have to be careful with the journalists sometimes. And okay, this species is native from the Indian and Pacific Oceans and was found in the coast of Monaco in 1984. Probably released from the Oceanographic Museum of Monte Carlo. The problem was that the first time was a bit controversial. I mean, it started to spread, but there was like controversial about the identification or the origin of the species. So they lost the opportunity. As we will see later, the only opportunity that we have to manage an introduction or an invasive species is if we act very early in the first moment of the introduction. So after this species, other species of Caulerpa was also found in 1990 in Libya, Caulerpa cylindracia, and in fact this species is spread much more in the Mediterranean and is dominating in the Mediterranean. And Caulerpa is able to exclude almost marine life. The impact is very, very high. And in relation with, we were talking about the early detection and early action. In California in 2002, they were able to eradicate, okay, with a huge cost using toxic chemicals. That is not really appropriate, probably, but they were able to eradicate the introduction. And yeah, here I want to show this study from Santa Maria and colleagues, very recent, because it gives some hope. I would like to say, because they show how biotic resistance by the native community, in this case by the native herbivores, makes difference. I mean, but it takes time. They say that they verified how now the local fishes, the native fishes, are starting to feed on the Caulerpa and are starting to control the population of the introduced the invasive species, and they are able to balance now the system. Okay, so I don't know. Maybe this is the only way for the future of Rugulopteris invasion. Just try to help a little bit, but wait until the local herbivores are able to feed on it. You know? The last species that I want to talk is lionfish. This is the Pterois volitans. The native area is from Indo-Pacific, and it was introduced in the coast of Florida. Again, escaped from aquariums in 1985. And this is a huge predator. This has a very strong impact on the fisheries, on the local fisheries, and in the coral reefs of the Caribbean. Also in the tourists, because it has also venomous spines, so it can have consequences for the human health. And yeah, again, the dimension of this invasion is so high that the local authorities, like the government, the managers, the researchers, they are trying to suggest different management actions. And for example, one of the options that we can visualize clearly with this, this cartoon is that they are trying to create a fishery, a dedicated fishery for this invader, and collaborating with the local chefs to make very good recipes and eat on them, basically, use as a resource. And this is why they have this, if you can beat them, eat them. That is an option that we have. This is also controversial, create like a resource, a market, a commercial use of an invasive species, but we have to keep in mind that this is sometimes the one option. So now I want to talk a little bit about regulation. I don't know how much time we have. We are fine. Just to have an overview about what we can do. Okay, but what we have in terms of regulation, what are the laws that we can apply when we are fighting against this problem? And internationally, we have from the United Nations this convention, in the Convention of Biological Diversity, already in 92, sorry, they call for action to address the problem with the exotic species. Yes, this was like the first call. But it was in 2010 that they launched this strategic plan, but suggesting like that by 2020, the invasive alien species and pathways should be identified and prioritized. But of course, we are not on that. I mean, we have some overall efforts, but not completely adequate. In the context of Europe, we have the European regulation, that is Marine Strategy Framework Directive, that was launched in 2008, as you probably all know. And they have 11 descriptors that all the member states has to follow to try to have the good environmental status for the marine European waters. And the description 2 is related with non-indigenous species that establish the threshold values for non-indigenous species in the European waters. And basically, we have several laws. Of course, as always, we have the umbrella from Europe, and then we have the different layers when we go for at the national level, and then at the regional level and local application. This is always like a filter, no? We can imagine that the actions that are proposed from Europe that are really good, but when we go to the local, it's not always working, at least completely, no? And as an example of this, we have this list, the invasive species list from Spain. That it is a very good tool, but the problem is that as I introduced in the first slides, we have a lot of different viewpoints in the problem. We have different interests. We have the lobby of the aquaculture, we have the lobby of the fishermen, and for example, when this list was proposed in 2011, they proposed 136 invasive species, but also 200 introduced species, like a list of species that are already exotic and are already present, but with a strong potential to be invasive and have an impact. This is a very useful tool, I mean. But then it was very polemic, and then it was blocked. And until 2013 was not really approved, and was approved without all these species that were potentially with a strong potential to be invasive impact. Basically, it's in permanent change because of all these different interests, and now we have around 185 invasive species in this list. The problem is that if one species introduced is in this list, then they cannot use for commercial purpose. So it's a tricky thing, it's complicated. So the thing is, can we really manage it? Can we do something? I mean, we have the legislation, we know something about the vectors, the mechanisms, okay, but can we really manage? And the question is, we can do something, but not a lot. And the only way is try to act, try to do something in the first steps. In the when the species is still introduced species and it is not invasive, and because the effectiveness of the actions will be reduced if they are able, if the species is able to dominate, to be invasive, and also the costs will increase. So it would be a waste of money and time. So the only way is early detection is the key. And for that, for the early detection, is really important the monitoring. For that, we have to optimize the resources, and then the best point, the best way, is to focus the monitoring on the marinas and harbors, the ports where the incoming alien species are coming with marine traffic. That is the main vector. And potentially try to include all the types of marine traffic, because the type of marine traffic, if it's recreational, if it's cruise, if it's commercial traffic, will determine at the end the type of alien species that are entering in the harbor environment. And as first step, is important try to do a historical compilation of the marine traffic. Try to analyze the marine traffic for the region, and to try to evaluate the connectivity. Try to characterize the connectivity of the region, and then evaluate the propagule pressure. Trying to establish a protocol for the biofouling, to sample the biofouling and also the ballast water of the tanks and the sediments. Here, for example, I am showing a study case that we did in the Madeira Island, where we did this historical analysis of the maritime routes incoming to Madeira Island from 1936 to 2004. And we were able to describe and analyze and kind of an overview of the connectivity of the island through marine traffic, characterizing the pressure. And we related this with the no indigenous species already present in the island. So we were able to characterize the more the more important routes that are with more probability to introduce alien species. Then, for the sampling, to try to monitor the arrival of no indigenous species, we have different methods. We have, for example, qualitative methods that are basically opportunistic methods, checking the different substrates that we can have in a marina or in a harbor environment, as floating buoys, as the walls of the docks, etc. Try to characterize the different organisms that you can have. And then we have quantitative methods that can be, for example, quadrant scrapings or photo quadrats. And we have also settlement plates or collectors to try to monitorize and characterize the arrival of the species. Also, we can use, and today are being introduced in the DINIA tools that are helping a lot to the identification of the organisms and also to assign the biogeography. Okay. Another very good source of information is the society in general. And for example, here you can see this application that is from Canary Island, that any user can document and can do a report of for the detection of an alien species. For example, here you can see the Cronius ruber, that is an introduced species in Canary Island. And then there is a list of experts that verify the report and then can upload. And from there, you can obtain a lot of information. And it's a really useful tool. The thing is, okay, we say that if we can act early, very early in the introduction, we can try summarization. But we have some examples in the terrestrial environment, maybe. And especially in island ecosystem, there are a few examples of success. But in the marine environment, we just have a very few examples. So yeah, the only way is early action programs, but the important thing is try to cut the vector of introductions. That's the best strategy, I think. And then we have the problem, what we can do when the species is already invasive. I mean, okay, we can try some eradication if it's really early, the detection, but what we can do if we have, as you all know, probably know these images from, you have something like this, that is the invasion of Rugulopteris okamurae in the coast of Tarifa, and is spreading into all along the coast of South Spain. And what we can do if we have this, okay. So yeah, we cannot do a lot, I think. That's a huge problem. But I wanted to show this study from several experts that they were analyzing the different options that we can have that are applied for the management of invasive species to try to contain or mitigate the impact and mitigate the invasion. In this study, they evaluated 12 model invasive species, for example, lionfish and the caulerpa that we were talking. What they did was analyze 11 different management actions, options that we have. For example, you have as first action like physically or mechanically remove the species. We have also promote native consumers, so try to help to the biotic resistance of the native community. And we have also education and public awareness, divulgation. And as you probably already see, is do nothing. Do nothing is also an option. I mean, sometimes better do nothing maybe than do something wrong. So yeah, at least they consider this action. And what they did was make a ranking in terms of effectivity, technical viability, social acceptance, impact in the native ecosystem, and also the costs. And it was interesting because the action with the highest score was always for all the species and groups the action 10 that was education and public awareness. So the best way is try to create conscience, no? And divulgate the problem, that we have a problem with the biological invasion. Also, the second action with higher score was the action 3, that was the commercial, the use of the dead specimens for commercial purpose. This is a bit polemic, probably, but it's probably one of the most effective, at least following this approach, this analysis. And just to end, I would like to highlight two cases that we have here in the region: the blue crab and Rugulopteris okamurae, the algae. That in relation with these two actions that are the two actions with the highest score. In both cases, they can be applied probably in relation with this action. Especially Rugulopteris okamurae is very evident for the people, very evident for the tourism and the impact that it's having. So we have an opportunity to create more conscience, to talk more about the biological invasions, and that we have a problem with that. So, and improve the monitoring and improve the control of the introduction of non-indigenous species. And in both cases, this is probably more controversial, and we can have different opinions. It depends of the person and the author. They use as commercial purposes, like trying to mitigate the invasion. Of course, it's always difficult if you create some dependency and you create a market related with an invasive species. But this is something that is being suggested during the last years. And thank you very much for your attention. I don't know if I took too much time, but thank you very much.
Excellent talk. So, well, I move on to the question time. If virtual assistants have some questions, please could you text it in the chat and we can read it?
Yep.
I think we can open the chat
Open there, no?
on the main monitor.
We have a first comment from Carlos. I could read it for you. Hello, Ignacio, an excellent speech. I just want to mention that on the Venezuelan coasts, we are recently having a huge invasive problem of the soft coral Eunomia stolonifera. Its expansion is speeding and covering literally all coral reefs and seagrass meadows, especially on the eastern part of Venezuela. It keeps spreading towards the western coast, and presumably it has already reached the Cuban coasts as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the comment. Yeah. This is something that it's happening with a lot of species in all the coasts or over the world. I mean, yeah.
And we do have a question from Jade. Thank you for your great talk. What is your opinion on the use of environmental DNA to try and monitor invasive species in marine systems?
I think it's a good tool that we have to consider, and I think it can help a lot, especially for the identification of the species, and also to assess the biogeography of the species. That is a very tricky thing in this type of studies, but we have to be careful about especially the databases, and yeah, and always maintain the combination of the two approaches, like more classical and morphological identification with the DNA approaches. But of course, we have to talk with our colleagues from that part of the molecular analysis.
Thank you. Yeah, there is another one. Thank you for your speech. I wondered if there are any databases where we can find the abundances, for example, tons per square kilometer of the invasive alien species in the Mediterranean. Are there any IAS fish included in the MEDITS survey, for example?
I am not sure. So if these databases are so specific, I mean, if you can find tons per kilometer, I don't know. I am not sure. I cannot reply you exactly. Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions here?
I don't see any other questions of the chat. I have one small question for you, Ignacio, that keeps on troubling me. But what is your personal favorite term of invasive species, alien or exotic? Throughout the call, you've used all of them. But what's your personal preference?
In the publications, I prefer no indigenous species when we are talking about the introduced species. But when we are talking no indigenous species, it's like I prefer to use alien species or exotic species, maybe. But the three terms are appropriate, in my opinion. Maybe no indigenous species is the best one. Yeah, but the exotic is very common, and also alien species in the bibliography.
Thank you.
Okay, so
Okay.
does anyone
more
have
questions?
anything else to ask? Well, so we end the session up.
Okay.
Thank you, Ignacio, and
Thank
to
you.
all attendees. And